My name is Tiffany, and I would love for you to empathize with me.
All right, y'all. I have one of my favorite people in the whole world, my sister Tiffany. How you doing?
I'm well.
You
I'm
well?
doing well. Yes.
How you feeling?
I feel hopeful. I feel I feel good. I feel good.
Okay,
Yeah.
cool. So, for the people that may not know you, how would you describe your personality?
My personality. That is so interesting. Even though it's asked often. I would describe my personality as calm. Earthy. uh Spiritual. And I don't even know if that really describes a personality. But that's how I would describe myself. Those are the three things that come to mind first.
Okay. So, what was it like for you growing up? And that includes stuff you've seen, things you've been through, where you live, your favorite stuff, the stuff you didn't like. Just as a kid, what do you remember feeling and experiencing?
Mm. Well, even as you ask that question, I think about why I describe myself the way that I do, calm, earthy, and spiritual. And I think about my childhood in Springfield, Ohio, and spending some time with myself as the younger sibling of an older brother who we grew up between my mother and my grandmother's house. So, single parent household. And when my mother was unavailable or in an unhealthy way due to her addictions, we would stay with my grandmother. And then I would mainly play with myself, and I would play alone, like outdoors, uh, spending a lot of time in my imagination. I'd spend a lot of time in my diary, sharing just writing down whatever experience I had. So I've been journaling since I was like 9, just writing down whatever experience I had, whether it be a crush, whether it be upset that grandma had me doing chores I didn't want to do, or even mourning my mother's instability. I would write about all those things as early as 9 years old. Growing up in Springfield was simple, I would say, because we just did what there was to do. We went skating, we went to the mall, we went to each other's house, we rode our bikes, like real simple. It wasn't a whole lot of complication, a whole lot of complexities in what there was to do. But I stayed busy. So my grandmother kept me active in church. There's a spiritual side, right? Founded upon Christianity. That's how I learned to tap into faith. That's how I learned to believe in something else out there in the sky. So that's how I really started to stretch my imagination and my hopefulness beyond the experiences that I had. So if my mother was out using, I would be praying and wishing and dreaming about when she wouldn't use, and that we would have this other life experience. And one day I would be a wife and mother with kids, and with the white picket fence or whatever the Cosbys looked like in my imagination. Like that's I spent a lot of my childhood hoping for a different reality and experience. And then staying active in the arts. So I was singing a lot. Grandma had me in church singing in the choirs, acting in the church plays, evolved into praise dancing, and eventually writing and speaking. I actually won speaking an essay contest that got me scholarships. So when I went to Ohio University, I had already won like $1,000 for speaking at a Martin Luther King breakfast in Springfield. Like things that, a lot of the things that I am now, I have been, evolved from who I'd always been as a young person. Even tutoring other young people at the Urban League. I was 14 tutoring other kids. And in the 5th grade, I wrote a little book that got recognized in the Young Authors Program. And the book was being raised by a single parent. Like that's what I wrote about, was my life experience. So it was definitely, cultivating who I am becoming in my foundation. And then meeting my father. I met my father, I was about 7 years old, and he lives in Georgia, and it was like meeting Superman. It was like, this is the man that I knew existed but hadn't had the opportunity to grow up with. And in that meeting I also met my sisters, and I just felt like I was in heaven, because these people kind of look like me a little bit, versus my cousins, and yet I really have a tight bond with my cousins. I have a tight bond with my family, my aunts, uncles, and I'm grateful for that. My brother, who's up here. But again, all of that helped to shape who I am and who I am becoming. So even my decision to go into social services or psychology, as I thought it was going to be, 5th grade. 5th grade, I said, I want to be a psychologist. I interviewed my school counselor to find out, how do I help people like you do? Man, Perrin Woods Elementary was the bomb. They was like, oh, that's what you want to do? Here's a Dear Tiffany column in the school newspaper. Kids will write you their problems, and then we'll work with you to help them come up with solutions. So that was real back then. And I went to OU, studied psychology, among other things, and that evolved into really working in youth development. So my childhood, even wanting to help other kids, wanting to help others, was all being cultivated from my experience in that single parent household, in that instability, that unstable environment, if you will. And somehow I was blessed to not be the statistical child that chose the same route as, the risk taking that my mother had chosen.
It sounds like as a child you could just always feel, like feeling was just your thing. What would you say it was inside of you that helped you navigate from being a statistic or being exposed to what you were exposed to? How are you able to just know you wanted something different? Because as a child, that's not an easy thing to do. So how did you do that?
First and foremost, by the grace of God, I truly believe that I am evidence and experiencing the answers to my grandmother's prayers, and to ancestors I probably have never met or will never know. Even my mother's prayers. So I attribute all of that, anything that I chose, that was so-called good or better or healthy, I believe is in alignment with what was prayed over me and spoken to me. I was called a prophetess. I was like, I was in the altar call prayer lines being spoken to about a calling on my life and the choices that I will make or should make, or that would veer me in a better direction. So first and foremost, that, and me believing it, because it was bigger and better than what I'm experiencing now. Just that natural affinity toward hopefulness and optimism in the midst of, absolutely observing, crack pipes being left in my house with the Brillo pads and the hangers, like finding relics of, people coming over to my house and using crack cocaine, and me seeing that and it hurting me, and then me praying about it or having, some anger about it, but still believing that something will grab a hold to my mother to help her come clean. And in that, I'm going to choose a path where I don't have to struggle with that. And that was my main, I think that's what I told myself, was like, I'm not going to do that, because that hurts people and it controls you, and I don't want to be controlled by a substance. So I veered away from substance use in general. And so, yeah, there's definitely some natural things that are in me, but overall, it's got to be the grace of God.
We previously talked, and a couple of times at different events, I heard you share about your mother's passing. What happened, and how did it impact you?
Well, first of all, I want to say, though the bulk of my childhood, I want to say till I was about 16, my mother used various substances. She got clean when I was about 16. And that's what brought her here to Columbus. That's what brought me here to Columbus. So when she came here to get clean and detox and join the program, and I said, I'm going with my mom so I can finally just be with her. And that was my best friend. So, and I say that I basically grew up here. So once I graduated, I moved here too. And so living life with my mom in her sobriety journey was absolutely fascinating, because I got to hear parts of her story, and I got to be in the NA meetings with her and listening to other people's story, and I'm sitting there just absolutely in awe of like how people can be addicted to something, can be addicted to a lifestyle, can be so ingrained in it. I mean, the things that people do to feed their addiction, and then find each other and help each other transform their entire lives and families. And that's what my mom did. Like, she became a sponsor of several women. She actually worked for an organization here to help others along their sobriety journey. And by being in what's called the rooms with other recovering addicts, she met a gentleman that I'll never forget. We were living together. I was in my 20s, late 20s. We were living together, and she was like, I met a guy. And so we talked about it, and then eventually he proposed, and they got married. And I just was so happy for her, because it was her first marriage. And so I was part of the wedding. A lot of folks turned out for that wedding and just were really excited for her. Well, a few years into their marriage, he relapsed. And in his relapse, he sought money that he felt she owed him, and they tussled, and ultimately he took her life. And he was eventually turned in and is now in prison. And that was 10 years ago. That my mother passed, and I remember that day like it was yesterday. I remember the day before, and I remember the day I got the news. I was at work, and they called me to my VP's office, told me the news, and that was probably one of the first times that I can recall like having to like consciously breathe, because I couldn't believe that this was really happening. Like, this can't be real. It was just like on the movies where the detective shows up and do you know? And it was like, do I know Helen? Like, why would you even ask me that? And their goal was to get to me before I saw it on the news, because it was already being broadcasted. And my goal was then to get to my brother before he saw it. So we ran to Springfield. Like, we rushed to go tell my brother. So that experience of losing I don't even like the word losing a loved one, having a loved one's life taken by their spouse, was I don't even know how to really describe it. I know that what occurred in the process of suppressing grief and grieving was a rebirthing of me, because it required me to sit with my feelings and not be so busy that I don't have time or space to feel. Again, I had survived childhood and that instability by being busy. And so that was my habit. When that happened, that initial was to stay busy. We had a funeral plan. I had things to cancel. I had to pack her stuff, plan. Like, it just was still busy. So I didn't even really experience the grief until like 5 years later. And that's when I broke. That's when I broke and experienced anxiety, depression, actual panic attacks, burnout. I experienced all of that, and it was a dark place. I don't know how to describe, like, you know how you operate, and then something happens, and then you just can't be you anymore. Like, you can't be as you were. And so it was this space in my life where I was like, I don't know how to be. So all I know to do is just whatever is in front of me. So I wrote a lot. I cried a lot. I slept a lot. I stayed out of the house a lot. I just really kind of hunted for myself during that season of grief. And out of all of that unfolded this deeper truth and deeper need for self-care and self-love, and all of that surrounding my mom and her using and her recovery and then her dying, like all of that revolved me more into myself ultimately, and then closer into the woman that she saw me to be before I did. Like, she saw a strength in me that I'm like, I don't know what you're talking about. She used to look me in my face and be like, how do you do this? Like, how do you act like you're good and everything's okay? She used to tell me that, and I'm like, what do you mean? How else am I supposed to be? I didn't know how else to be. But she's saying, why aren't you some broke, tore up kid that can't get A's, that can't focus in school? How do you sit up straight and fold your hands in class, and your mom's out here on the street and don't pick you up on time? And I would smile and hug her like nothing was wrong. Like, I didn't know how else to be.
Wow.
And so eventually through, and this is just interesting talking about it, like through the evolution of her being, I eventually and continue to discover more about myself.
So, with the depression and panic attacks, all those different things, how did you find your way through it, or how did you find understanding in it? Because it seems with all of us, there's a stage where we're like, I'm okay.
Yeah.
I mean, I've been feeling like this for a long time. It shouldn't bother me that much, but then it hits and you're like, oh, I'm really depressed. Yeah. I'm having panic attacks, and I can't pinpoint why when I know everything that's happened to me.
Yeah.
How did you navigate through it, or are you still navigating through it? And how did you find understanding in it when it came to how you responded to the things that happened to you?
I've already talked about the grace of God, so I can reemphasize that. And so for me, being in it, I remember Googling nervous breakdown. I remember actually Googling, like, what is a nervous breakdown? Because that's what I felt like I was having. And Google is, knows everything. So I was like, okay, wait. Because and now that I've done a little more studying about trauma and trauma response and the brain, the impact on the brain and nervous system and all of that, I can look back and be like, dang, But I didn't know that. Even though I was doing social services and youth development work, I didn't look at me and be like, that was a traumatic experience. You need to process this in a healthy way. I did try grief counseling, and it was not effective, because I knew how to show up. I'm okay. Yeah, this happened to me. And so they took that as it was. So I basically, I did start digging to try to find out what is happening, what is this. I did seek counseling, and the biggest aha moment was when my therapist, beautiful mentor, friend that I love, she did a 10-year timeline of my life, and basically we marked all these big changes, shifts, things that have happened in my life over the past 10 years. And she was like, yeah, like, this is not a normal lifeline. Like, it's okay. This is why it's okay for you to not be okay. And I was like, I never looked at it like that. Basically, it was a trauma response to fall into, particularly because I had suppressed the grief, didn't know how to grieve. So I just kept being and doing. The depression was dark. The anxiety was so intense that I could not even hear my children's voices. Like, hearing them call for me was triggering. Like, I was so sensitive. Any stimulus was like, everything was too much. So that's why I spent a lot of time in solitude, in the dark, and literally like chasing the moon. I would find a parking lot and just sit and stare at the sky, like, for solace, because I could find quiet, and I could also somehow find my creator in the sky for a moment. And then ultimately, community, having people I could talk to, having people I could be around who saw me, like, didn't see the mask but saw me. And I didn't even know I was wearing a mask, but they could see around it and be like, there you are. And I'm like, oh, what? Oh. Was I hiding? I didn't know. So being around loving community was huge. Finding those spaces, being in creative spaces where nobody's judging you, finding those kind of spaces where nobody is like expecting anything from you. Journaling, writing, like, regularly, daily, every moment, reading scripture, praying. Then I started practicing meditation and yoga to move my body, to actually tap into my breath and to speak affirmation to myself. Spending time in nature, like, all of those things were my menu of self-care, and it became more and more intentional as I did it. It was like, oh, that felt great. Let me do that again, because it's not harming anyone and it's helping me. So that's how I ended up really allowing God to move me through the experience of depression and anxiety. I can say now that I no longer experience the symptoms of depression and anxiety in that way. The worst panic attack I ever had, I was able to get my therapist to come to my house, and because I couldn't even move, and she helped me catch my breath. Like, she really helped me find my center in that moment. And I had to let a lot of things go, and that's really what happened too. It's like all the things that crowded my life, I had to eventually be like, okay, I need to set some boundaries and actually leave room for myself. Yeah, so you can actually, with the breath, what's called regulate, or bring your body into homeostasis, into balance, simply by selecting the pace of your breath, the depth of your breath. And that's the physical benefit. For me, the spiritual of it is, it gives me time to decide what I want to think about. So I may pull on a scripture, I may pull on a prayer as I breathe, and then that supports me into going into, for lack of a better word, just a higher space, a more spiritual perspective of things. And that's one way that I tap into hope regardless of what's happening. So with all that's going on right now, like quite honestly, with all the global things that are going on, that is not my biggest concern. My concern is the immediate, is what's happening right now. How is my family? Do we have what we need? Am I managing my life in a way that aligns with my purpose so I can show up and be effective in the work that I do and that I'm called to? So even now, just a deep inhale. And then every time we exhale, we're releasing what we don't need. We're releasing carbon dioxide. And what I don't need, nature needs. So it's still in alignment with purpose. And yeah, it's this cycle of I have something for you, you have something for me, and we get to have this exchange with nature and with each other, right? As I'm calm, I can bring you calm, right? So that energy is so vital. And so I actually developed a coaching program around it, and an acronym of breathe that actually helps me help others catch their breath, add oxygen to their life, start to self-actualize and kind of align with their dreams and their vision by facing those things that obstruct, and get in the way of life. It could be childhood experiences that they've never faced. Well, I've faced a lot of my childhood stuff. I'm facing a lot of my adult stuff. So because I'm maybe a step here, I can then reach back and be like, well, this is how I did it. Let's find what'll work for you. Here's my menu of self-care tools. Let's find what tools you need to feel well and to really return to love, because for me, that's what it's all about.
Okay. So some people know you for the poetry that you do. How did you find poetry, and what does it do for you?
That's a fun question, just because the first poem I remember writing was called I Cry Blue. And well, no, that's the first poem I really felt proud of. Like, I wrote a poem, want to hear it kind of thing. I was 13 and I had a crush on this guy that moved away. So my heart was broken, right? Because before that it was like Roses Are Red poems for Mother's Day. So that's really where I started, was like with heartbreak. And I think I got into the habit of, this is what poetry is for. It's for my sad feelings. It's for my love feelings, when it had to do with, I don't even know if I can call those relationships, but feelings, right? Emotions that I had about someone. And then eventually it evolved, and I felt like by the time I got to OU and saw like spoken word and poetry in action for real, I was like, oh, it's more than just I'm in this sad place. Like, it's a message. Like, you can actually do stuff, impact people, inspire people. And so that's where it really evolved. I was around like 19 when I did my first like spoken word piece that I still do to this day, that I was really, really proud of, because it felt more like something that was channeled through me more so than something that was cultivated out of an emotion. So I believe that poetry, for me, and spoken word is an opportunity to share how you feel, but it's also an opportunity to evoke feelings, to like share something with someone else that can move them toward a new thought or a different action or even hope or encouragement.
Are you comfortable with sharing that poem?
Oh my gosh. Do we have time for that? Yeah, sure. Actually, just thinking about it is bringing back a lot of emotion, because I've shared it in spaces and shared it in ways that like meant a lot to me. It's called My Soul's Imagination. I hope I can remember it.
You got it.
What, 21 years
Whatever
ago?
you got, that's what we gonna put out.
my love is my soul's imagination. So maybe you can imagine my soul daydreaming of a world where love is real, overstepping the boundaries placed on it by fear. In my world, love is more than something you feel. It's not synonymous with happy, like, or care about. It doesn't exist in the midst of doubt because it is its own separate entity, yet innate within you and me, existing quietly and patiently, awaiting its time to finally be set free from the confines of the flesh. In my world, love isn't an emotion. It's not as complex because feelings change and get rearranged and feelings get hurt. But in my world, love does not hurt. Love remains the same, and it is presented as a gift, not a gift exchange. Love is a painless application of one's spiritual desires, only relying on the faith that what is given will be returned in due time. Love is not a pet or yours or mine, but it is untamed, seeking whom it may inspire, and wild like fire as the candle lit, with your heart as the wick, melting away to change into a purer, more natural form of vapor. Though you can feel it as if it were a tangible solid, it only speaks the language of the spirit in unknown tongues difficult to interpret. See, no bare man can understand without the helping hand of a guide who is all-knowing, all-seeing, and forever flowing like an invisible fountain, cleansing you and me. Love is that divinity that we can't see, and it expresses itself unconditionally. So don't try to define it or describe it or place it into some neatly wrapped box with bow and ribbon called expectation. Give love room for expression, room for expansion. Beyond using love for lack of a better word, it's more vast than that. Beyond candy and flowers and cute notes on my pillow, love isn't that shallow. You can't wade in love, placing one toe in at a time. You must be submerged in it. Submit to it. And love is not blind, but it's innocent, like a child, not knowing any better. Love just loves for its own sake without question. So don't ask God why he loves you as unworthy as you may think you are. And don't ask why you love who you love. Just accept that you do. Because as long as my soul imagines, I will be loving you. Sheesh. It's been a long time since I've done that one.
Just here recently, you experienced a major accident that was serious. The accident that you experienced, what happened, and what was the process of you nursing yourself back to health?
So that was another trauma. And so October 5th, 2019, my daughter and I were on the freeway headed to an event, and honestly, without an explanation, I found us headed toward the back of a truck, and with no time to stop, we slammed right into the back of a semi-truck. What's wild is I recently spoke about it in the TED Talk for TEDx KLB, and talking about that and revisiting that just again reminds me of the grace of God, because the truck was absolutely totaled. My daughter was fine, I'll say did not suffer physical injury. It did result in her experiencing her own bouts of anxiety from that traumatic experience where she saw me, trapped and bloodied and broken and having to get rescued with the jaws of life. I mean, I remember the glass shattering and being taken to the hospital and having friends like picking glass out of my hair for days. So as a result of the accident, my arm was broken, my hip was dislocated, and because it was one-sided, it kind of left me with needing more support and recovery. So I was in a wheelchair for several weeks and had to regain strength in my right leg. My arm was in a cast, and so even the walker that I had to be special because I couldn't use my hand for the walker. What was amazing to me was, one, that I was conscious the entire time, And while I was trapped in the truck, literally like breathing and meditating and praying and hearing prayers outside the window, and being conscious enough to let people know that we were alive and to reassure my daughter, and to maintain consciousness even after receiving the pain meds. I remember things that I said in the ambulance, and I was like, I might have been a little loopy, telling them, don't rip off my boots. Like, please don't tear my clothes. Y'all tearing up my clothes. Like, to be in the midst of something like that and still have like enough whatever humor, or to be so high that you thinking about your clothes and you got a broke nose. Like, I don't know. But I was absolutely fascinated with that entire experience because I couldn't believe it happened to me. Like, I was just good, and then moments later I'm in a hospital bed. Like, how? The love of the community that was shown to me, people showing up with flowers and cards and good food, which is a whole nother thing, part of that self-care menu. I'm not going to eat the junk y'all are giving me. Like, that's not going to help me heal. So when I got into the rehab center, I was like, salad, oatmeal, fruit. You don't want don't give me, I don't want your Salisbury steak out. I don't know what that is for real. Like, just even that, like eating differently, and then eventually, like, for real, letting myself be pissed off. Because anger was something that was forbidden in my childhood. I wasn't allowed to show anger. What child has the audacity to be angry at anything in a household that said, look at what you have, like, what do you have to be angry about? So I learned that through my journey, was to actually feel anger, and I felt it, and I was pissed off, and I fussed at God, and then I fussed at, whoever else I felt like was responsible, including myself. You know what I mean? Like, just allowed myself that moment to be mad, and that's really where my healing started to take off. Once I let myself feel and told myself, okay, now that I've done that, I'm ready. And that term allowed me to show up to encourage others. It allowed me to lean more deeply into my healing in each realm of my being, so emotionally, physically, spiritually, mentally. And ultimately was able to leave the recovery to be cared for by community at my home. And even been able to travel in the midst of it all, being in a wheelchair at the airport so I could go down and be with my family down south, like all of that. And there's so many pain points and pressure points, that's what I'd rather call them, along the way for me to get to where I am today, even just from last year. But ultimately, it all supports the evolution of my being, so that once again I could be who I need to be to fulfill the purpose that God has for me, so I can help others do the same. And I give thanks. I give thanks every breath. So gratitude is in the roof, and that's probably why I'm like, y'all talk about stay at home. Listen, I was sheltered for 20, like I couldn't go anywhere. I didn't even see outside for weeks. And then at the rehab center, they took me outside, and I was like, oh, that's right. Jesus, like, how can just let me be near a tree? Like, please. I mean, you smell hospital, and you know what I mean? Like, there's just things that we take for granted, that even those who are sick and shut in, or who are disabled, or who are in a position where they are unable to really explore life, experience nature, even if it's for a few days, we take it for granted. So I do my best not to take that for granted. Ability to walk and move my hips how I don't want to move them. To grasp something with this hand that I had to like practice and go through physical therapy.
Wow.
all of that within the span of a year. Like, God is amazing, and so is the body. So if we can fuel our body with oxygen and good food and movement, like, it'll be good back to you. Like, people thought this scar was a tattoo. I'm like, nah, you don't know what this scar used to look like, man. This looked like a horror film. This used to look like a horror film, So, I mean, to be able to function with steel rods in my arm, like, to actually have, to see God work healing out in this body just makes me more grateful.
Motherhood.
Yeah.
So you shared some of the experiences you had with your mother. Now that you're a mother, what would you say your biggest lesson or realization is? Your realization is having children and caring for them.
Wow. There's been a few moments of awakening to the power of parenting. One is, I remember hearing and reading, and the two shall become one flesh. And at one point, I remember saying that, looking at my children and being like, oh my God. That's how, two become one in this person. That's really what parenting. Oh, reproduction. You reproduce yourself into these people. It's not, it's not this kind of trivial thing. Like, oh, I have a baby. No, you created another version of you. Like, what in the world? And that moment was like, oh my God, that means my insecurities, my fears, I could actually pass those on. So I became really conscious about even the way, for example, we talk about math. I don't like math. Math intimidates me. But what I never did was stood around my kids and be like, I hate math. I'm not good at math. You probably won't be good at it either. No. You know what I mean? Down to those minute things that or habitual things. Just shifting, being mindful of the language that I use around my kids, being mindful of how I carry myself, and how I love myself. Once my daughter dealt with self-esteem issues, I had to look in my own mirror and dig into affirmations on a deeper level. Looking at my spiritual journey, making sure they see me pray, journal, meditate, practice yoga. I want them to see me love on myself so that they can decide how they're going to love on themselves. Affirming their giftings and not blocking. Connecting them with community that aligns with the things that they feel an affinity toward. My daughter's a visual artist, among other things, so she's in there on a Zoom with Transit Arts right now. My son's a musician and declaring it between that and being a DJ. So he is aligning with experiences that cultivate that gifting, because at the end of the day, if that aligns with their purpose, they're going to succeed at it. In addition to whatever, intellectual exercise is going on with the way schooling is happening right now. They're gaining skills through this experience that school doesn't even intend for them to gain. The resiliency that it takes to show up for a screen every day. To me, that's amazing. That's amazing that they're doing it and they're doing well. So I believe that conscious parenting is its own full-time work that, when done in love, it can help these little human beings decide how they will evolve and overcome the traumas that they will experience, and make decisions and choices about what their life experience is going to be like. And that's what I told my children. I said, you know what? I'm here to guide you, coach you, direct you, discipline, to support you in making decisions, because ultimately you're going to choose how you want to talk, what you want to listen to, what you want to watch, who you want to live life with. Those are going to be your choices, with or without my consent. Whether I'm there or not, you're still going to choose, no matter what I say. So I'm hoping that the values that their dad and I agree upon and cultivate in them, that they are going to make decisions that align with their purpose.
With your daughter looking at you as an example of what it means to love yourself, to have high self-esteem, to love on yourself, how important is it to intentionally pass those things on to a young girl as a mother?
One of the things that I gleaned from my grandmother and my mother was the importance of being who you are, regardless of others' opinions, perspectives, perceptions of you. My grandmother was unapologetically the church mother. Like, she was the one that was shouting even if people were throwing darts at her. Figuratively or for real. She would shout and praise God, and my mother showed up as herself and had her vulnerabilities tucked away on occasion, but she showed up as her in the midst of whatever environment, even if it was going to rub people wrong. And so I believe their message to me is that, and I am now learning that. And because I'm able to now raise my daughter as I show up more authentically, I pray that that's the message she's getting, is that she can show up authentically as who she is, accepting herself more openly and fully, loving on herself in every aspect of her being, and being mindful of who she shares herself with, which is also important to me for her to know, is that there's so much value in who you are. Everybody doesn't get the privilege of yanking on your energy, of being in your close-knit circle, let alone touch or show affection to your body. And so I hope that she values herself in a way that, again, shapes her decisions, that aligns with the values that she'll ultimately agree upon, and that aligns with her sense of purpose, so that she can have the peace, love, and joy that I'm continuing to affirm in my own life, in my own self, every single day. It's something that I declare over myself and my family, is peace, love, and joy.